I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm delighted to welcome today Daniel Knowles, who is the author of Carmageddon, a book I think I came across when I was doing some research about trains. And somehow, some algorithm kicked it up to me. And it's totally relevant because obviously it's about mobility and transportation. But it's a book that surprised me. So, Daniel, tell us about yourself and how you came to write this. But I've seen a couple of reviews or notices called a high octane polemic against cars.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Daniel Knowles. I'm the Midwest correspondent for The Economist magazine at the moment. But this book really has its genesis in a time when I lived in Nairobi. I was the Africa correspondent for The Economist, and I had a car. It's the only time in my life that I've had a car and relied on it, and I loathed it. I think about of all the things of that job of living in Kenya, that was probably the thing I hated most, just having to deal with traffic. And so I began thinking more and more about urban transportation. Urban economics has always been a thing that had interested me, but I became slightly obsessed with it because I realized this isn't just a thing in the past. The fastest growing cities in the world are adopting very car-centric models of development too. So I think that's when I began to think, this is a book I can do, and it could move the conversation on a little bit from, Jane Jacobs or the sort of car criticism of the new urbanists a little bit. So that's why I came to write it. I moved back to the UK in 2019. I started the book during the pandemic and then finished it when I was here in the US.
And you're from Birmingham. Now, Birmingham has its own car history. I think you should tell. And then you were at Oxford, and Oxford has a car thing too, right?
Yes. So Birmingham was until about 2005 when the Rover plant closed, the center of the British car industry. And it had this great sort of misfortune in a way to be a very rich city because of that in the 1950s. And so when these very car-centric sort of urban planning ideas were in vogue, Birmingham was one of the British cities that did it most and, built these expressways, through the city center.
Famous for those over, what do they call flyover kind of things?
Exactly. The most famous one is known as Spaghetti Junction, which was the first sort of, multi-level interchange in the United Kingdom, I believe. And it is still a very car-centric city. The traffic is appalling, and most people get around by car. There are cars parked all over the place, blocking pavement, sidewalks. And I grew up, with the car. And then I moved to London and realized moved to Oxford first and then to London and realized you don't have to be so dependent on them.
Yeah. So the book, why don't you explain Carmageddon? What were you trying to accomplish in the book?
So what I really wanted to do was write about the economics of transport. I didn't just want to write a kind of cars are trash and don't you hate them, and isn't it nice to be in cities? That is obviously a large part of it. And the stuff that I believe, but I wanted to kind of explain why it's not inevitable and why it's not only that people prefer cars. There's often this thing you hear, which is like, but people choose cars. You'll never get them out of their cars. And I wanted to kind of explain why actually incentives push people to be in cars. And the world is set up in such a way, and policies have made people feel they need to have cars rather than it being, a preference for driving around.
Human, kind of primary human need and desire. Can tell us about those incentives. What has pushed people, Americans, and now, people, I go to Beijing. I've been driven like 2 blocks in Beijing so people could show off the car, that there's nowhere to park it. And we could have walked walked more quickly. So what is it? What is going on?
So the really obvious ones are things like free parking, which, is provided by law in a lot of places and means that you can always park your car on what should be valuable land for free often. Roads that are not charged by the mile. And as kind of gasoline taxes have fallen over the years, that cost of driving has fallen. The pollution that they create not being properly accounted for, the congestion that each driver creates not being accounted for. And really what it all adds up to is a sort of collective action problem. For you as an individual to have a car is often a very good idea, and particularly if you were the only person to have a car, as the sort of early adopters were,
Yes.
then having a
Yeah.
car is brilliant. You can go everywhere, you can arrive quickly in comfort, and nobody else is stopping you. The problems emerge when everybody starts having cars, because they begin, not only to make life harder for everybody else not in a car, but also for the people in cars themselves. These cities have to spread out. You have to have parking everywhere. They once a very large proportion of people have cars, it becomes very difficult for anybody to choose not to have a car. And that's really what I think is the kind of the big incentive here. It's this big collective action problem.
Mm-hmm. And you've written in the book about urbanization and the way and the effect of that, but also, of course, as people began to drive more, then in Britain, for example, they closed down loads of the old train routes. So suddenly people in villages who didn't have never had a car and kind of would get the bus or and the train quite, you know. So where is that collective? I mean, I assume there's a tipping point then.
Yeah, and you could see it in the UK in the 60s, which was when the Beaching Acts came in, when you had this very rapid rise in car ownership. Europe in general was a bit behind the US in that, but it all happened very quickly that people could afford cars, and everybody wanted one for the reasons I
Uh-huh.
basically just outlined. And, the government saw this happening.
Yeah.
So, um, yes, and the number was soaring, and there was, in fact, in the early 1960s, this incredible report by a civil servant called Colin Buchanan, which essentially argued that, the number of cars would overwhelm Britain, would destroy its towns, and would, make public transport unviable, and kind of came to all those very correct conclusions, and then sort of said, but people will want them and politicians won't be able to resist it. So here's how we can sort of at least mitigate the worst damage. And
Great. Sure thing.
exactly. And that is essentially, it was very influential. It sold huge numbers of copies to the general public, believe it or not, this government report.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it came in, and passenger numbers on the train network dropped precipitously, and as subsidies on it grew, the Beaching report came in, and they ended up closing down all these branch lines, which were these train lines that went often to smaller villages or to
Uh-huh.
smaller towns. And the trams, which were rickety and noisy in London, were replaced by buses. But then it turned out that buses were easier to cancel too. So you had this sort of evisceration of
Right.
public transport over decades as car usage rose in this sort of vicious spiral.
Hmm. Now, one of the things that you might think, or readers might think from the title, that Carmageddon is a negative book, but I found it quite the contrary. I thought what you did you told some stories that were not uplifting, but you also really showed us a lot of things, gave a lot of examples of places that were doing things better, and also offering the example of your own life without a car, and actually making it clear that people can live. I mean, that's one of the things. What, you don't have a car or you don't drive, it surprises people. And so that I thought was a very really nice part of the book, that story. So I mean, I love that. But do talk about, I thought perhaps telling us about Tokyo. Your story about Tokyo would be a nice.
Yes. So I picked out Tokyo as a place to write about for, well, a couple of reasons. The first one was just that I wanted to write about somewhere that doesn't rely entirely on kind of car usage, that has that's a walkable public transport oriented city, but is not Amsterdam or Copenhagen or Paris, because people in very car centric cities will know about lovely European cities that they can go on holiday and walk around. But, they'll say, yes, but that would never work here. Of course, they're hundreds of years old. They were built before the car, but we can't replicate that here. But Tokyo was mostly built after the Second World War. It was bombed flat in the war and then rebuilt. And it, nonetheless, has some of the lowest car usage rates in anywhere in the developed world. And the reasons why are, they're historic in a way. They have a street pattern that's often very narrow streets, but there are two big policy choices that the Japanese made in the 1940s and 50s. The first one, they made street parking essentially illegal. So if you want to own a car, you have to have a parking space. And then the other thing was that when they built their highways, and they do obviously have the expressways, they paid for them with tolling, and the tolls are quite expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to drive in Tokyo, if you need to drive, you're transporting something heavy or whatever, you can.
Okay.
But you don't pay this, sorry, you don't get it for free. You pay a reasonable cost that accounts for the sort of social costs here. Most of the time, that means that people will take the train, and they have very good public transport, which is profitable. That's the thing that people often don't realize. It's profitable because it can compete on an equal basis with cars in a way that it can't in other places. And people cycle a lot in Tokyo because they can cycle usually to the train station and then take the train. And they have, very good facilities around the train stations. So it works. And actually it works in a way that I think of as a kind of liberal free market capitalist system of transport here. I kind of wanted to make that point too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And your description of Tokyo, I haven't been there in a while. Being surprised, because I think you went there from Nairobi for getaway, and because as you said, we see a lot of pictures of Tokyo as it very few, very modern, obviously, because it is. And crowded, the dense crowd around the train station. But you said you found it to be quite different in reality, which matches other things I've read. But this is something I think that those of us, Americans say, or people in car-centric cities might like to have in their minds when they hear about a vote on something to do with public transit or bike lanes.
Yeah, I almost should have said this right away. The thing that shocked me turning up in Tokyo, I took the train from Narita Airport, and I got off it in Shibuya, very central neighborhood. And just walking down the street, I was astonished at how quiet everything was. You could hear bird song, you could hear kind of, just people walking. And of course, a little bit of that is that the Japanese are very quiet, but most of it was just the absence of vehicle noise, of cars on streets, of tires and of engines. And it was so surprising to me just initially. And of course, I'd flown in from Kenya, which is very noisy all the time, but it was so quiet. And the other thing is that if you look at buildings individually in Tokyo, if you took a photo of one building and you looked at it, you wouldn't say these are attractive buildings. They're often concrete, very modern. But you look down a street and they're really lovely streets. They just look kind of pretty. And if you think about it, it takes you a little while to realize, but the thing that makes them attractive isn't the architecture, it's the absence of cars. It's the absence of these big metal just littering the street.
I always think of it I live near the Red Line in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and there's a famous Norman Rockwell painting of that street at Christmas time on a snowy day like the one we're having now. And every year they do, they sort of restage it and there's some old cars in the photo, but nowadays it's just packed with cars. and they have to clear them away to make it look nice again. You wouldn't want to paint it the way it looks now.
There's a thing that I think affects almost all people who live in a city, actually, almost anywhere in the world now, which is a kind of blindness to cars. They're everywhere in such a way that if you see them, if you kind of notice how much space they take up, you'll go insane. Um,
Mhm.
as I feel like I have at times. And so you just sort of mentally block them out. And yeah, once you begin to see how ugly they can make everything, particularly when you go to these very sprawling cities and you'll have a restaurant that's, occupies a space that is 20% restaurant and 80% parking lot, you begin to think this is madness.
Yeah. Well, I thought about something that you then wrote about when I visited Denver, is I was reminded, because I live in a small New England town, so it's in some ways it's got some of the constraints of a European city, But Denver, although they've invested a lot in public transportation, it's sprawled out, and to go to different things, to do different errands, you literally have to drive. Stop, drive, stop. And because I'm working on third places, the sort of social vitality, there is no social vitality when a place is dominated by cars in that way. But but what I wondered when I was there is how on earth would one reconstruct that? I mean, have you seen any models of, to how both changing people's habits and also just re realigning the transport priorities that you've been impressed by?
Yeah, more and more. In the past few years, one of the things that I've been amazed at how quickly it's happened in the US is getting rid of these like parking mandates and
Mm,
you can see places actually a relatively a modest but a good example is Minneapolis, which if you look at photos of downtown Minneapolis from even 10 years ago, so much of it was parking. And now they built loads and loads of housing because they got rid of this law that said, there has to be a certain amount of parking
mhm,
per per apartment. And developers came in and suddenly were like, oh, it's super profitable to build apartment blocks on these parking lots. And people moved into them because they could walk to work. And so there are these little pockets of downtown Minneapolis which have
mhm,
become very walkable and they pedestrianized a couple of streets. And there are a lot of examples of that. I mean, Paris is a very good example. Paris was always to some extent walkable public transport. I mean, it was always
mhm,
walkable, but you
mhm.
would be walking through very traffic clogged streets.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
they have completely transformed that, and it feels just absolutely wildly different. Rather than you picking your way down one side of a street, you have the whole thing to yourself when you're walking, and that draws people in. I give an example literally from around the corner from me, in fact, which
Mhm,
unfortunately I wish it were a permanent one. But every month, the street that runs near my house, Milwaukee Avenue, which is a main sort of shopping thoroughfare in Chicago, they have had a day where they closed a street to cars. And the number of people who've come out, just to walk up and down, to go to cafes and bars, to go shopping, it it's so many more people just on the street than it would be otherwise. And I think it's hard to do if when I've been to Houston, I begin to think I have no idea how you turn around the city like this. But I think where you have some public transport by expanding it or changing, making relatively modest changes, frankly, it's the market comes in. People want to live in dense places. And so, apartments get built, people cluster in, businesses come in, and suddenly things can change quite quickly.
Because people actually will walk in the street. If they have a chance to walk in the street, they will. But I guess we're instinctively and sensibly afraid of cars. So so if there are a lot of cars around, of course, we're not gonna feel as comfortable walking.
cars make every other transport system harder. That's the problem with them.
Mm,
They make it far more dangerous to walk or to ride a bike.
mhm,
They make public transport less effective because, buses get stuck in traffic, so they're slower. Train stations, even trains are taking you between places that are more spread out. So when you get out the station, you've got to walk further, possibly through
mhm,
a giant
yeah,
parking lot. So that's the sort of overwhelming problem with cars, is that it's not really a choice. Once more and more people are using cars, every other choice becomes worse.
mhm.
But yeah,
So
you get rid
why
of them,
what
people want to walk.
yeah, so what would you say is the reason? Well, what I'm seeing now, even in a walkable small town, people driving big, big, big cars, having trouble parking them, driving round and round to get a parking place as near they wanna park right in front of whatever shop they're going to. I mean, how do you break the cycle and get people we have new bike lanes, but nobody's on them. What do you do to break that?
It's tricky because I do think, as much as, I wrote in the book about the incentives here, there's absolutely a cultural element. And once people have got used to driving somewhere, driving all the time, they have what I think in the book, and I don't think I came up with this, but is a windscreen mentality. You begin to see the entire world through your windscreen.
Mm,
And
mm,
for some people, it becomes
mhm,
very difficult to imagine getting around other ways. So there's any other way. So they're sort of instinctively hostile to things like bike lanes
mhm,
or to restrictions on where cars can go. And, not everybody will change, unfortunately, but I do think there's reason to hope. Young people are driving an awful lot less than they
mhm,
used to. If you look at why traffic is still rising, it's because you have this older generation of people who never really drove all that much before, especially women. If you go back to the
yep,
generation born in the 30s or the 40s, to
mhm,
the baby boomer and Gen X who, grew up with driving, and they're just driving far more into their retirement. So that's why traffic's still rising, but young
mhm,
people are driving a lot less, and there is this demand, it's increasingly fashionable to not drive. So
right,
hopefully it's
yes.
changing.
It's hopefully
Yeah.
changing. So, of course, some people say the solution is simply to have electric vehicles. So
And
let's address that because you didn't really get into that in the book, and yet it's obviously something people are talking about
I
and
yes, I
aware of.
wrote a bit about it in the book, and think I think electrification has to happen because, I do not believe, sadly, that we are going to get rid of all the cars anytime soon. And so for the sake of global warming, of local
Mhm,
air pollution, we have to do this. But they are not a panacea at all. They have many of the same problems of cars. They still create congestion. They actually still create local air pollution. That their tires
mhm,
rubbing a lot of the particulate matter. And I don't think anywhere is properly prepared for how much electricity they use. And particularly now at a time when we're adding all these data centers to the grid as well.
yeah,
I was talking to a friend the other day who's recently swapped to an electric car, and he was saying his electricity use has doubled. So we've got to build all these more power plants and everything else to fuel these things, just as we, also want to switch our heating systems to electric
yes,
systems, all these
yeah,
things. So
yeah,
so I just think that the idea that you can just replace, you know, gasoline powered cars with electric ones is absurd. You need to be simultaneously trying to reduce the amount people choose to drive at the same time, because otherwise we're never going to hit our climate targets. And
yeah.
we are going to create all these other problems for ourselves too.
I have just been reading about the obsolescence in electric cars. I mean, and so I've always been concerned about the waste. If you replace a internal combustion engine car with an electric car, somebody's still going to be driving that old car. It might be shipped overseas, but something's going to happen to it. It doesn't just vanish off the face of the earth or suddenly break up into its constituent parts to be, you know, and nobody seems to address that. That is a, if
Yeah.
you, so, and then if electric vehicles are apparently, and this is why I'm asking you what you've, heard about this or, know about this. Will they need to be replaced in the way upgraded the way smartphones are upgraded?
Well, I mean, yeah. So your first point about, where the gas-powered cars go,
Mhm.
absolutely right. When I lived in Nairobi, I drove a Japanese car that was 20 years old, that some
Mm.
Japanese person had sold, and it had got exported to Kenya. So
Mhm.
yeah, these cars have very long lifespans. So, just replacing them with electric cars, yeah, it will take ages.
Mm.
And then the second point, yeah, the obsolescence. I'm not really sure, but what I certainly know is that the batteries in these things don't last forever, and they are very environmentally damaging to
Mhm.
produce. I spent some time for the book in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and saw some of the
Ah.
mines where the cobalt
Mhm.
goes into these things is
Yeah.
mined, and they are pretty grim and support a pretty awful system of government there.
Mhm.
And yeah, the lithium batteries will have to be replaced. And now I'm hopeful that battery technology is one of those things that's coming along very fast, and that
Mhm.
might change. But these cars won't necessarily last forever. I don't know. I don't know a huge amount about that. I think
Mhm.
the batteries are the big fear. I think in
Mhm.
other ways, electric motors very simple, and as far as I understand it, shouldn't need to be replaced. So in
Yeah,
some
what I'd
way,
read about was the computer system, the
oh
actual,
yes. Yes, well, that's
um
the car industry generally doesn't want people to just keep their cars forever, so they are more and more
yeah.
computerized, and they would love us to upgrade them like our phones, which obviously, you know, also can last an awful long time if you let
Yes.
them. But people always want the newest features, and I think
And
that's
if
what comes with
you
cars.
don't
Yeah.
provide the support too,
Yes.
I mean, that's the way a corporation can manage it
Yes,
is,
quite.
"Oh, we don't
Yeah.
provide you with the we can no longer provide you
Yeah.
with the
Right.
security upgrades." And then where are you?
Right. And
Uh,
people can't repair their own cars anymore, which I think
yes.
is just an interesting side effect, actually. I think, one of the small positive aspects of that is that it's kind of killing the motorhead modified car world a little bit. It means you have less cars being very noisy, these sorts of modified vehicles. But yeah, I think what you raise is a really interesting question
Mm,
that if I'm honest, I haven't thought about hugely. Mm.
mm.
Oh,
Let's talk about the car industry. You write about it in the book, you write about, some examples, but let's because yeah, I have 2 questions. I have the, the influence, the sort of political importance of the car industry, because obviously, I do a lot of work related to trains, and people always say, "Oh, but trains cost money. It costs money to build trains. Who's gonna pay for that?" As if the roads and the money that goes to support roads is invisible. It's become invisible to taxpayers. So that's an issue. But also the economics. I mean, you are the perfect person to ask. The car industry is a major, it employs a lot of people in the kind of jobs that we apparently, need and want to keep, and that people want those jobs. So how do you transition, given that kind of importance and influence?
yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, if you think of the United States, the average family spends $12,000 per year on transport, and almost all of that is on cars,
Mhm.
buying them, maintaining them. And if you think about what share that is of the economy, it's something like 10% of GDP. It's something like
Yeah,
16% of the average
yeah.
household spending. And so, yeah, that's a lot of jobs, not only the people building these cars, who I think are the most politically
Mhm.
salient, but also the car dealerships, and there's so many car dealers in Congress now. Also, the people who run auto repair shops, the people who run gas stations and supply the gasoline. So there are all these jobs that would have to shift. And I work for The Economist. I believe in capitalism and I believe in creative destruction. And I kind of think we'd be fine moving those jobs into things that benefit people more. But it would be a huge challenge. I'm living in
Yeah.
Chicago. I spend a lot of time reporting in Michigan. And, whenever you talk to government officials in Michigan, the car industry is so dominant, and you say, well, look, this has been in decline in the number of jobs for
Uh-huh.
40 years. You need to
Uh-huh.
diversify, don't you? And they say, well, maybe, but no, the car industry is the really important thing. We will always be building cars in Michigan. And it's kind of, I think it's almost an abusive relationship in some
Uh-huh.
ways, but it's very difficult to get those sort of, I think what people miss, frankly, are union jobs with like good pensions and things. But those in
Uh-huh.
small towns and, outside Detroit, that sort of thing, those are the good jobs that are available. So people are very fearful of giving them up. And, think of the towns in Janesville in Wisconsin, or you can point to lots of places where the car industry has disappeared, and it has been socially devastating and taken
Uh-huh.
years and years for those places to recover. So I understand the political salience, but I think it's a real challenge because the costs are concentrated, but the cost
Uh-huh.
to the rest of us are of having to support these industries is enormous. Mm,
Right. So
mm.
it is a political challenge. Here's my question. Why can't they build trains? We have a real problem building trains in this country. And that's what I've been asking people. Why don't we just train these guys to convert the factories, start converting them gradually, and
It's
start
a
building trains in Michigan?
It's a great question, and you go back to the creative destruction. That's what I mean. Are if you get if you can take away 5% of GDP that we have to spend on cars now and bring it back to to something else that can be useful stuff, and trains would be a really good thing to do. So
Very, comparable skills,
yeah,
probably relatively, as things
exactly.
go, the same kind of job, and we desperately need to be able to it's a real issue in the train business is
I
getting train equipment.
Yeah, and I think parts of the problem we've just loaded so many costs onto building trains, particularly here in the US, but I mean it also applies in the UK, where building a new train line, has all of these problems of acquiring land. You have to satisfy all of these, people who
Mm,
don't want it to affect their view or whatever. The rolling stock, the actual trains, we apply all of these
yeah,
like
yeah.
safety standards to them, which is good. They should be safe, but we don't apply the same things to cars. And
Right, that's
and
so
often we
true.
go a bit overboard. If you look at the newer Acela trains that they've just introduced in the
Mhm.
Northeast Corridor, they took years to come online because of essentially safety standard questions, which, sure, safety standards are important, but these are the same trains they use in Europe. We kind of knew that they're safe. It was just this like
Right.
bureaucratic stuff from the,
And they've built
yeah,
these fancy trains that look like Chinese high-speed
yeah.
trains, but they can't go as fast because the tracks aren't good
The
enough.
trains can go, yeah, 200 miles an hour. The tracks, unfortunately, were built in the 1800s and have a lot of bends, so it doesn't work like that. And and maybe it's good to buy the nice trains in case one day you change the tracks, but I feel like you need more plans to change the tracks.
Yeah, a little more strategic thinking on this
Yeah, yeah.
would be good. So, um, I mean, I think it's really helpful to people to hear about good models. So, do you have any other examples of things that you things to be avoided?
Well, I think one of the great models, because it's so simple, and has happened recently is New York City's congestion charge. And of course,
Uh-huh.
New York's not the first place to do it. We knew it would work because we'd seen it work in
Yeah.
London and Stockholm, in Singapore. But it's the first place in America to do this. And it has been exactly as I predicted, yet also miraculous. It's hard to think of more of a
Uh-huh.
win-win policy.
Uh-huh.
Traffic has dropped. The number of people coming down to Manhattan has increased, even though traffic has dropped, because
Uh-huh.
more people are taking the subway, are walking,
Uh-huh.
and there's greater capacity that way. The number of traffic injuries has dropped. The amount of hooting, the
Yeah.
noise has dropped. And the people who do still need to drive are having a much better time. Yeah, sure, they're
Right.
paying their $15, but they're also no longer sitting for an hour waiting to get through the tunnel back
Mm.
to New Jersey. So
Yeah.
it's a win for literally everybody, including the drivers. And there are
Mm.
lots of other places in the United States which would be able to do that. Here in Chicago,
Uh-huh.
they could toll the expressways that come downtown. They already toll them outside of the city in the suburbs,
Uh-huh.
but they don't toll them in the city, which is where the traffic is bad. And it would benefit pretty much everybody, I think, but people would whine about it.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
San Francisco, another city that this could work.
Uh-huh.
So those are my examples of where I think you can do well. An example of, I think, somewhere that's gone unfortunately wrong is, while trying to do the right thing, is Los
Uh-huh.
Angeles. In
Uh-huh.
LA, they have built these new subway lines, which
Uh-huh.
are great, and they've raised taxes to do this, and people have enthusiastically
Uh-huh.
agreed in referendums to raise their taxes. All of that's great. But what they have done is they've not thought about it in land use terms. So very often you come out of one of these fancy new subway stations and you walk into a parking lot. And that's meant that the ridership has never really lived up to what they hoped. And I think they are now beginning to change that. They've got new laws that will allow more housing to be built around those stations.
Uh-huh.
But for 10 years, they've spent a fortune on these train lines, and then not been able to get.
It's not just point A to B and back and forth. That's how I find transit guys tend to think.
You've got
It's
to
just
think
getting
about it
from yeah.
holistically, and
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
land around the stations
Yeah.
is like is just a really
Yeah.
important part. And in so many places, people think of them as completely separate things, like
Yeah.
zoning, transport, and they have to be completely linked up. And one of the things, before I lived in the US, I sort of imagined, well, nowhere has any public transport. And then you visit
Uh,
lots of cities and you realize they have a surprisingly nice new streetcar, or subway that goes nowhere, and so nobody uses it. So, it goes to a suburban parking lot,
mhm.
which is what happens in a country that is quite rich, but in fact is
Yeah.
extremely rich, but doesn't, government is so unjoined up. So it's like,
Yes.
yeah, we'll build this great project, it will solve our traffic problem, and then it doesn't. And then people go, oh, public transport's a waste of money. And it's like, yes, it is if your train goes to nowhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm encourage everyone who's interested in whether you're interested in environmental issues or social connectivity or just the economics of it, where our tax dollars are going, to get a copy of Carmageddon. It's a great read. I've really enjoyed it, and I so appreciate you joining me today.
And thanks ever so
Thank you.
much, Karen.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for joining me at The Way We Live Now, where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration. Please leave a comment and subscribe to the newsletter at karenchristensen.substack.com.